Australia was recession-prone with high unemployment, high interest rates and high inflation. We're inward-looking and yet increasingly exposed to the competitive rigours of the global market, where comparative advantage in natural endowment, in agriculture and mining commodities in particular, and protection of inefficient industries would not suffice for competitive strength. Never equate comparative advantage with competitive strength, and yet we did. The imperative for reform was utterly compelling, though not universally appreciated. It took political courage and unstinting commitment of the newly elected Hawke government to stare down the vested interests of their traditional constituency, coupled with the political determination of the Howard-era opposition in the face of some aggressive and politically disruptive agrarian socialism. Hawke, Keating government, not Keating as Prime Minister, but Keating as Treasurer, will probably go down in history as one of the most defining governments this country has ever had, closely followed by Howard and Costello. Under Hawke's leadership initially, and then Howard's bipartisanship in opposition, and then leadership in government, Australia vigorously pursued a comprehensive reform agenda, notwithstanding strident opposition from some business groups and members of the unions, trade unions of course, and the community groups. And I say trade unions because they just love the protected shop. So today we can look back on 3 decades of incredible reforms, floated the exchange rate, established the independence of the Reserve Bank in setting monetary policy, deregulated financial and labour markets, instituted superannuation reforms from a defined benefit to a defined contribution, significantly reduced barriers to trade and foreign direct investment and industry's assistance. More to do, but made a lot of headway. We reformed public enterprise. We introduced competition policy and we privatised state-owned enterprises. We established a policy of national fiscal discipline, budget in surplus over the course of the economic cycle. And we delivered major direct, indirect and business taxation reforms. And Australia, of course, with deep external interests, was prominent in the global pursuit of open market trade and investment reforms. We did pretty well on the trade in goods, not so well on services and not so well on investment. More work to be done. The third driver of that era of change was industry leadership. You see, that era profoundly changed the significance and the method of public policy advocacy, emphasising the real underlying currency of effective representation. And for those of you who are already starting to go to sleep, if I only leave you with one take-home message, it is this: integrity and credibility in advocating good policy in the national interest. If that's the only thing you take out of here, I will have at least had some value add. This profound shift in advocacy arguably, in my view, had as much to do with the establishment of 2 new organisations, the National Farmers Federation and the Business Council of Australia, as it did the governments of the day. In particular, I credit NFF back then with as much of the success of that early reform era as I do the governments of Hawke and Howard. They established a policy platform and an execution strategy that has to be seen today through the prism of that incredible reform era. The 2 Macs, McLaughlin through to McGeechy, set a platform that did our industry proud, but established a magnificent approach to public policy advocacy and economic reforms that continue to stand this country in good stead. That was a big deal for agriculture back then. It was a really big deal. When you consider the history of regulated marketing arrangements, the subsidy and protectionist practices of our international competitors, there are plenty of people who thought the tariff compensation argument had something going for it. Well, they've got it, we want it too. That was a very popular argument, and the ever-present undercurrent of agrarian socialism, never more obvious when there was a natural disaster or drought assistance. I remember being in Queensland and you'd have one good year in 13. Well, that became the benchmark for a normal year. And then every other 12, all the other 12 years were the droughted years and you got assistance. talk about coming off the cow's udder. It was unreal. And of course, agriculture faced entrenched resistance from manufacturing lobbies who were quite happy to have a consumer and taxpayer tax on the efficient agricultural industries to prop up inefficient industries, textile, clothing and footwear, passenger motor vehicles, just to name a few. This brings me to essentially what you wanted me to tell you, and that is what do I think are the essential ingredients of public policy advocacy? I've given you a bit of a tip. And how do I think that relates to the essential ingredients of going about representing an industry's interests in terms of a policy platform? Well, I've picked out top 10. And they're not in any order of priority because you've got to have all of them. It's a bit like when somebody asks you to prioritise things, and it's sort of, the metaphor would be like asking somebody, do you want to eat, drink, sleep or have sex? You've got to have all four. Even if as you get older, the fourth one becomes a little bit difficult. But these top 10, you've got to have them all. The first one is a foundation policy platform to the enduring transformation of Australia's socio-economic orientation to open markets, to individual enterprise and initiative, both in culture and structure, underpinned by efficient and effective regulation. Now, what does that mean? It means go the market and only regulate when there's market failure, and only regulate when you can demonstrably be sure that government intervention is going to correct the market failure, both on a prima facie platform and an effective platform. Back where I come from, mobile phone goes off with $50 in the cookie jar for the Christmas party. It's an important point. I used to have these discussions with Alan Fells, who I regard as a friend, many times, and I say it's not just about competition. If you go after competition, I'll bet you the only thing left standing is one. You need to make sure that your regulation is to ensure that your markets are actually competitive on an efficient and effective platform. And you will always have market failures. But unlike Europe, we actually let the market work, then we fix it if it fails in particular areas. Europe actually regulates for how they think a market should work. Well, governments cannot pick winners, and that is a recipe for failure. I guess the only other point I'd make under that one is that that whole point of the Hooke-Howard reform era in Australian economic policy was to improve the economy's flexibility, our supply side capacity and adaptability, so that labour and capital, which is the basic factors of productivity, move to where they can be most productively used. It's what economists, and I'm not one of them, call the theory of comparative advantage. And it's always violated when governments intervene to try and determine and differentiate and second guess where those resources ought to go. And remember the truism, protection damages primarily the protecting economy itself. And if Australia has something to really be proud of, it's through the Uruguay round of trade negotiations, we were actually able to convince the rural sector that it was in our interests to remove protection more so than it was in those that we were trying to negotiate. Trade negotiations are about commitments, not concessions, even though you'd be forgiven for thinking the other way. Second, national interest is preeminent to sectional interests. The national interest, in my view, is defined in terms of global competitiveness and sustainable development. Sectional interest can only really be effective and sustainably advanced through that cause of the prism of the national interest. The needs of the nation should always clearly dominate the wants of the few, whether they are in business, civil society or politics. There haven't been major policy issues in my 25 years as a CEO in Canberra that I thought should be necessarily quarantined to a sector or sectional interest. And in fact, we've even seen government institutional arrangements shift If I had my druthers, I wouldn't have a Department of Agriculture. I wouldn't have a Department of Resources and Energy. I wouldn't have a Department of Industry or agriculture or forestry or whatever, manufacturing industry or tourism. I'd have all that lumped into Treasury and finance and trade and environment and social. They're the disciplines. Those are the portfolio responsibilities.